We received thank you cards for gifts we never sent. The first card arrived on a Wednesday in late October, mixed in with the usual bills and grocery store circulars. My wife Rachel handed it to me while I was making coffee, her expression puzzled. "Did you send something to the Lewises?" she asked. I didn't know anyone named Lewis. The card was elegant, cream-colored with gold embossing, the kind you'd send for a significant gift. Inside, the handwriting was neat and formal. "Dear Thomas and Rachel, we cannot thank you enough for the generous wedding gift. The crystal vase is absolutely stunning and has a place of honor in our new home. Your thoughtfulness means the world to us. With gratitude, Amanda and Richard Lewis." I read it twice, then looked at Rachel. Neither of us had attended a wedding recently, and we certainly hadn't sent a crystal vase to anyone. Rachel suggested it might be a mistake, someone with a similar address. I almost agreed until I noticed our names were spelled correctly, our exact address printed on the envelope. This wasn't a misdirected card. Someone had deliberately thanked us for a gift we'd never sent. I set the card aside, chalked it up to some strange confusion, and went to work. I'm an accountant, trained to track numbers and spot discrepancies, but personal mysteries weren't my domain. Rachel, a teacher, found the card more interesting than concerning. She said that evening. Neither explanation made sense, but we let it go. 2 days later, another card arrived. This one thanked us for a set of luxury bedding sent to someone's baby shower. Again, we'd never attended the shower, never met the recipient, never purchased any bedding. The card was signed by a couple in Connecticut. We lived in Oregon. Rachel's amusement turned to concern. "This is weird, Thomas. Why would multiple people think we sent them gifts?" I suggested, checking our credit card statements, looking for unauthorized purchases. We spent that evening going through 3 months of statements, finding nothing unusual. No crystal vases, no luxury bedding, no unexplained charges. The third card arrived 5 days later. This time it thanked us for a generous donation to a children's hospital in Boston. The amount mentioned was $500, and the card included a tax receipt. I stared at that receipt, feeling the first real stab of alarm. If someone was making charitable donations in our names, they might be doing it for tax fraud purposes, claiming deductions we'd never authorized. Rachel called our bank immediately, requested a full review of all accounts. The bank found nothing. No $500 donation, no missing money, no signs of compromise. The representative suggested we might be victims of a different kind of fraud, where someone used our identities to make donations they could then claim on their own taxes, but the mechanism wasn't clear. I filed a report with the Federal Trade Commission, started the process of freezing our credit, took all the standard identity theft precautions, and then the cards stopped coming. For 3 weeks, nothing. I started to think maybe the problem had resolved itself, that whoever was behind this had moved on to other victims. Then my mother called. Eleanor Whitmore was 78, sharp as ever, living in an assisted living facility in Seattle after a stroke 2 years ago, had made independent living too risky. She called me most Sundays, our conversations following familiar patterns. How was Rachel? How was work? Had I seen my brother lately? When would I visit? This call was different. Quote 5, she said, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Did you send an expensive watch to the Johnsons? They're thanking me every time I see them, and I have no idea what they're talking about." The Johnsons were another couple in her facility, people she played cards with occasionally. I felt my stomach drop. "No, Mom, I didn't send them anything." "What kind of watch?" She described it, a luxury brand, something that would cost several $1,000s. The Johnsons had received it with a card saying it was from Eleanor Whitmore, a thank you for their friendship. My mother had been mortified, insisting she hadn't sent it, but the Johnsons showed her the card with her name, the return address of her facility apartment. I told my mother about the thank you cards Rachel and I had been receiving, about gifts we'd never sent. There was a long silence on the line, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more frightened. "Thomas, there's something else. I've been getting thank you notes too, here at the facility. I thought I was losing my memory, that I'd sent things and forgotten. But if you're getting them too..." She trailed off, and I heard the fear underneath. My mother had been terrified of dementia since the stroke, Worried every forgotten name or misplaced item meant she was slipping into cognitive decline. These cards had made her question her own mind. I promised to drive up to Seattle the next morning, told her not to worry, assured her this wasn't her memory failing. This was something else, something deliberate. After hanging up, I looked at Rachel across the kitchen table. I said. Rachel's face paled. Why would someone do that? I didn't have an answer yet, but I was going to find one. The drive to Seattle took 5 hours, time I spent mentally cataloging everything strange that had happened in recent months. Rachel came with me, had arranged for a substitute teacher, understood this was serious. We arrived at Meadowbrook Assisted Living just before noon, found my mother in her small apartment looking more fragile than I'd seen her since immediately after the stroke. She'd gathered all the thank you cards she'd received, 7 of them, spanning 3 months. Each one thanked her for extravagant gifts, a silk scarf to a woman in the facility, a first edition book to a staff member, a set of golf clubs to someone's grandson, a donation to the facility's renovation fund. The amounts and items were staggering. If my mother had actually sent all these gifts, it would have cost her close to $10,000. I asked if she'd noticed any money missing from her accounts. She shook her head. She had always been meticulous about finances, a trait I'd inherited, but she also relied heavily on her caregiver, a woman named Beverly Yang, to help with online banking and bill payments since the stroke had affected her right hand's dexterity. Beverly worked at the facility, provided both general care and personal assistance to several residents, including my mother. She'd been with Meadowbrook for 3 years, came highly recommended, and my mother had spoken fondly of her many times. I asked to meet Beverly, said I had some questions about my mother's accounts. The facility director, a woman named Janet Kowalski, paged Beverly to the office. She arrived within minutes, young, maybe 30, with a professional demeanor and a ready smile. I explained about the thank you cards, about gifts that were supposedly sent but weren't reflected in any financial statements. Beverly looked concerned, appropriate levels of confused. I help Eleanor with her online banking every week, she said. I've never seen any unusual purchases or donations. Are you sure the cards aren't meant for someone else? I showed her the cards, showed her my mother's name, our names. Beverly maintained her confused expression, but something flickered in her eyes when she looked at the card, thanking my mother for the renovation fund donation. Just a flash, quickly controlled, but I'd spent my career reading people's reactions to financial discrepancies. She knew something. I pressed her about the donation specifically. Quote, 15. Beverly hesitated, then said carefully, quote, 16. But my mother was already shaking her head. Quote, 17. I asked Beverly if she'd witnessed my mother making any of these gifts. She said no, she hadn't, but maybe someone else had helped her, maybe another staff member. Director Kowalski interjected, defensive of her facility. Quote, 18. I asked to see those protocols, asked about oversight and auditing. Kowalski grew more defensive, suggested we were making accusations without evidence. I wasn't accusing yet, but I was definitely suspicious. After the meeting, I told my mother I was going to investigate further, asked her to keep track of any other strange thank you cards or comments about gifts. Rachel and I checked into a hotel for the night, and I spent the evening on my laptop, researching elder financial abuse. What I found was disturbing. A pattern of caregivers and facility staff exploiting vulnerable elderly people, sometimes through outright theft, sometimes through more sophisticated schemes involving identity theft and credit fraud. One article described a case where a caregiver had opened credit cards in residents' names, made purchases, and then paid minimum balances using the residents' own money, keeping the scheme going for years before anyone noticed. The gifts were a variation on that theme. Someone was spending money in our names and my mother's name, but the money wasn't coming from our accounts, which meant they were either using credit we didn't know about, or the gifts weren't actually being purchased at all. That second possibility made me sit up straighter. What if the thank you cards were fake? What if someone was creating elaborate fiction to make recipients believe they'd received gifts when actually nothing had been sent? But that didn't make sense either. The Johnsons had physically shown my mother the watch, and I'd seen photos of it. That was a real gift, actually purchased and delivered. So the money was coming from somewhere. I pulled up my mother's credit report, something I had authorization to access as her financial power of attorney. It took several minutes to load, and when it did, I felt a cold shock of recognition. There were 3 credit cards I'd never seen before, 2 major bank cards, and 1 department store card, all opened within the past 6 months, all with significant balances. Total debt across the 3 cards, $34,000. Someone had been systematically opening accounts in my mother's name, making purchases, and paying minimum balances to keep the accounts from defaulting. The purchases on the statements were interesting, not the usual pattern of identity theft. No cash advances, no electronics, or easily sold items. Instead, there were purchases from high-end retailers, charitable donation platforms, specialty gift shops. Whoever was doing this was actually buying gifts and sending them, all on my mother's fraudulently obtained credit. I checked Rachel's and my credit reports next, my fingers trembling on the keyboard. We had 2 unauthorized cards between us, smaller balances, about $8,000 total. The same pattern, expensive gifts, donations, all things that would generate thank you cards and receipts. This wasn't typical identity theft for personal gain. This was something stranger, more calculated. I called the police non-emergency line, explained the situation, was told to file a report in the morning. Then I called the credit card companies, reported fraud on all 5 cards, started the process of disputing the charges. The representatives asked standard questions. Had we noticed any missing mail? Had we given our information to anyone? Had we been victims of a data breach? I couldn't answer most of them. We hadn't noticed anything wrong until the thank you cards started arriving. Someone had been very careful, very patient, building this house of cards over months without raising any red flags. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rachel lay next to me in the hotel bed, her breathing deep and steady, but my mind was racing through possibilities. Who had access to our information and my mother's? Who could have opened these accounts without being detected? The most obvious answer was someone at the assisted living facility. They'd have access to my mother's personal information, her mail, her daily routines. But how would they have gotten Rachel's and my information? We'd filled out extensive paperwork when my mother moved into Meadowbrook, providing emergency contacts, financial power of attorney documents, insurance information. That paperwork had our social security numbers, our addresses, our dates of birth, everything someone would need to open credit accounts in our names. I'd trusted the facility to keep that information secure. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. The next morning, Rachel and I went to the Seattle Police Department and filed a formal report. The officer who took our statement, Detective Luis Navarro, listened carefully and asked pointed questions that suggested he'd seen cases like this before. Quote, 19, he said. Quote, 20. I asked what we should do next. Navarro said he'd investigate, but recommended we also hire a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. The police can pursue criminal charges, but getting your money back, proving the full extent of the fraud, that's going to require someone who can dig deeper than we have resources for. He gave us a name, Gabriela Torres, a former FBI agent who now worked financial fraud cases privately. I called her from the parking lot, explained everything. Torres said she could meet us that afternoon, quoted a rate that made me wince but seemed necessary. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and Torres impressed me immediately with her thoroughness. She wanted copies of everything: the thank you cards, the credit reports, the fraudulent account statements, my mother's financial records. She asked about everyone at Meadowbrook who had access to resident information, wanted a full staff list, volunteered to go undercover if necessary to observe the facility's operations. If this is internal staff, Torres said, they're probably not working alone. Financial abuse at care facilities often involves multiple people. Someone to get the information, someone to open the accounts, someone to make the purchases and intercept thank you cards before victims see them. You seeing the cards means something broke down in their process. Torres explained that sophisticated fraud operations often sent gifts to people within the same community, facility residents, staff, local organizations, creating a closed loop where the thank you cards would come back to the facility and be intercepted before reaching the actual cardholders. But they couldn't control cards sent to people outside the facility, Torres continued. That's how you and your wife got yours. Someone thanked you for a gift at a wedding or baby shower, sent it to your home address, and they couldn't intercept it. The theory made sense and was deeply disturbing. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was organized, planned, sophisticated. Torres said she'd start by investigating the facility staff, particularly anyone with access to resident records and financial information. She'd also trace the credit card purchases, figure out where the gifts were actually sent, see if any patterns emerged. While Torres started her investigation, Rachel and I spent the day with my mother, going through her apartment with new eyes. We found other thank you cards she'd forgotten about, tucked in drawers and on her bookshelf, at least 10 more, spanning back 8 months. The earliest ones were small gifts, modest amounts, but they'd escalated over time. Someone had been testing, seeing how much they could get away with before anyone noticed. We also found that my mother's mail routine had changed in recent months. Beverly, her caregiver, had convinced her that it would be easier if Beverly collected her mail from the facility mailroom and brought it to her apartment. My mother, trusting and grateful for the help, had agreed, which meant Beverly had complete control over what mail my mother saw and what disappeared. I confronted Beverly about this when she came for my mother's afternoon medication check. I didn't accuse her directly. Torres had warned me not to tip off any suspects before we had solid evidence, but I asked pointed questions about the mail routine, about how my mother's personal information was stored, about who else had access to resident files. Beverly remained calm, almost too calm, giving careful answers that revealed nothing. But when I mentioned that we'd hired a private investigator and filed a police report, I saw something cross her face again. Not fear exactly, but calculation. She was weighing options, considering responses, and that level of calculation suggested guilt. After she left, I told Torres about Beverly's reaction. Torres said she'd prioritize investigating Beverly Yang specifically, would pull her financial records, her employment history, her associations. What Torres found over the next 3 days was damning. Beverly Yang had worked at 3 different assisted living facilities over the past 7 years. At each previous facility, there had been unexplained financial irregularities, residents reporting missing money, mysterious credit card charges, gifts allegedly sent that no one could account for. None of the facilities had pressed charges, had instead quietly let Beverly go and moved on, apparently preferring to avoid the scandal and potential liability. This was common in elder care, Torres explained. Facilities worried more about reputation damage than about justice for victims. By allowing abusers to resign quietly and move to new facilities, they enabled ongoing victimization. Beverly's bank records showed deposits that didn't match her salary, thousands of dollars over the past year, always in amounts under $10,000 to avoid automatic reporting requirements. Some deposits came from accounts belonging to Meadowbrook residents. Beverly was stealing directly from the people she was supposed to care for, but the credit card fraud was more complex. Torres traced the fraudulent accounts and found they'd been opened using computers at a business called All Care Administrative Services, a company that provided billing and administrative support to multiple care facilities, including Meadowbrook. The same company that processed resident intake paperwork and stored personal information digitally. Torres pulled corporate records for All Care and found something interesting. Beverly Yang's brother, Daniel Yang, worked there as a data administrator. He had access to every resident's personal information across a dozen facilities. Beverly was the inside person at Meadowbrook, identifying vulnerable targets and setting up opportunities, while Daniel opened the fraudulent credit accounts, using information from All Care's database. Together, they'd been running this scheme for years, moving from facility to facility whenever they got too close to being caught. The purchases and gifts served multiple purposes, Torres explained. First, by actually sending expensive gifts rather than just making cash purchases, they created legitimate paper trails that looked less like fraud. Second, by sending gifts to people within the care community, other residents, staff, local organizations, they built goodwill and reputation for their targets, making the elderly victims look generous and active, deflecting suspicion that something was wrong. Third, by intercepting most of the thank you cards, they kept victims confused about their own finances, made them question their memories, isolated them psychologically. Quote, 26, Torres said. Quote, 27. The cruelty of it made me furious. My mother had spent months worrying she was developing dementia, questioning her own memory, all because these people were deliberately making her doubt herself. Torres had gathered enough evidence to bring to Detective Navarro. Together, they built a case that included not just the fraud against my mother, Rachel, and me, but evidence of fraud against at least 15 other residents across 3 facilities. The total amount stolen was over $400,000. Navarro obtained warrants for Beverly and Daniel Yang's arrests, for searches of their homes and devices, for AllCare's records. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning. Beverly was taken into custody at Meadowbrook in front of other staff and residents, which felt like appropriate public accountability. Daniel was arrested at AllCare's offices. Both maintained their innocence initially, but when confronted with the evidence, the credit card applications from Daniel's computer, the bank deposits matching stolen amounts, the pattern across multiple facilities, Daniel broke first. He agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, provided detailed information about how the scheme worked. Daniel explained that Beverly would identify residents who were cognitively vulnerable, socially isolated, or had family that visited infrequently, people less likely to carefully monitor their finances or question unusual activity. She'd gain their trust, become essential to their daily routines, convince them to let her handle mail and paperwork. Then she'd provide Daniel with their personal information, and he'd open credit cards or access existing accounts. They'd make purchases, send gifts, intercept thank you cards when possible. The minimum payments came from small withdrawals from the victim's own accounts, usually amounts small enough to escape notice, $50 here, $100 there, listed as cash withdrawal or miscellaneous expense. Over time, those small amounts added up to thousands of dollars, used to keep the fraudulent accounts active while the balances grew. When one facility got suspicious or a victim's family started asking questions, Beverly would resign and move to a new facility, and they'd start the process over. They'd been doing this for 4 years, refining their techniques, becoming more sophisticated. But Daniel also revealed something I hadn't expected. They weren't the only ones running this kind of scheme. AllCare Administrative Services had been facilitating similar operations by other employee-caregiver pairs, sometimes knowingly, sometimes through willful ignorance of obvious red flags. The company's owner, a man named Marcus Bellamy, had created a business model that depended on high staff turnover and minimal oversight, making it easy for bad actors to exploit vulnerabilities. Several AllCare employees had been flagged internally for suspicious activity, but were never reported to authorities or fired, just moved to different facility accounts. The company was essentially enabling systematic elder abuse for profit, taking their administrative fees while turning a blind eye to how their access and tools were being used. When Navarro heard this, he expanded the investigation to include AllCare itself and Marcus Bellamy personally. This was no longer just about 2 individuals committing fraud. This was about institutional complicity in widespread elder abuse. The scope of the case grew rapidly. Navarro contacted Adult Protective Services, who identified dozens of additional victims across the facilities AllCare serviced. Many victims hadn't realized they'd been defrauded, had accepted the thank you cards and confusion as their own failing memory, had been too embarrassed or uncertain to report concerns. One man, Harold Preston, had been convinced by his caregiver that he'd developed early-stage Alzheimer's and needed to sign over financial power of attorney to the caregiver. By the time his daughter discovered this, he'd lost $80,000, and his home was in foreclosure. An elderly woman, Ruth Shapiro, had been told she'd made generous donations to various charities and should feel proud of her philanthropy, even as her savings were depleted and she could no longer afford her medication. The stories were heartbreaking, each one representing not just financial loss, but betrayal of trust, psychological manipulation, and violation of dignity. The criminal case moved forward. Beverly and Daniel Yang both faced multiple charges: identity theft, wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, theft by deception. Marcus Bellamy and AllCare were charged with conspiracy and facilitating fraud, with additional civil liability for failing to protect vulnerable populations despite clear warning signs. The prosecution was led by an assistant district attorney named Priya Kapoor, who specialized in elder abuse cases and came to this work with personal fury. Her own grandmother had been victimized by a similar scheme years earlier, and she'd made it her mission to hold perpetrators accountable. Kapoor built an airtight case, methodically documenting every fraudulent account, every forged application, every intercepted piece of mail. She interviewed victims and family members, brought in forensic accountants to trace money flows, consulted with elder abuse experts about the psychological impact of these crimes. The pre-trial process revealed more layers to the fraud. Torres, continuing her investigation, found that the gifts Beverly and Daniel sent weren't just random acts. They were strategic relationship building with people who might be useful later. The expensive watch sent to the Johnsons? They were being groomed as potential future victims. The donation to Meadowbrook's renovation fund? It created goodwill with facility administration, made them less likely to question Beverly's access and activities. The gifts to staff members? They created loyalty and complicity. Staff who'd received generous presents were more likely to overlook suspicious behavior or cover for Beverly. The entire scheme was more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, a multi-layered operation designed to exploit trust, isolate victims, and create networks of obligation and silence. Torres called it, quote, 30, using generosity as a weapon to manipulate and control. The trial began 8 months after the initial arrests. Rachel and I attended every day, sitting with my mother and other victims' families, watching as the prosecution laid out the full scope of the abuse. The evidence was overwhelming: hundreds of fraudulent documents, bank records showing the flow of stolen money, testimony from victims about how their trust had been exploited and their minds had been manipulated. Beverly Yang showed no remorse throughout the trial, maintaining a blank expression even when elderly victims testified tearfully about the impact of her betrayal. Daniel Yang seemed more affected, occasionally looking down or away during particularly damaging testimony, but his cooperation with prosecution had already been secured. Marcus Bellamy attended with expensive lawyers, projecting confidence that crumbled as witnesses from All Care testified about his knowledge of suspicious activities and his explicit instructions to employees not to report concerns to authorities. The most powerful testimony came from my mother. She took the stand on the 6th day of trial, and I watched her transform from the fragile woman who'd questioned her own mind into someone formidable. She described the stroke that had made her dependent on caregivers, the fear of cognitive decline that had haunted her recovery, the trust she'd placed in Beverly Yang. She explained how the thank you cards had made her question her sanity, how she'd started writing everything down obsessively, trying to prove to herself she wasn't losing her memory. She detailed the psychological impact of being deliberately gaslit by someone she'd trusted with her most vulnerable moments. When Kapoor asked how the fraud had affected her, my mother looked directly at Beverly and said, quote, 31. Several jurors were visibly moved. Beverly's lawyer tried to paint my mother as confused and mistaken, but my mother held firm, her testimony unshakable. Other victims testified about similar experiences: the psychological manipulation, the deliberate confusion, the isolation from family who might have noticed the fraud earlier. Ruth Shapiro, who'd lost her savings while being told she was generously supporting charities, testified about being evicted from her apartment when she could no longer afford rent, about her daughter finding her living in her car, ashamed to ask for help because she believed she'd foolishly given away all her money. Harold Preston testified about signing over financial power of attorney while impaired, about discovering too late that his home was being sold without his knowledge. Each story painted a picture of systematic predation on the most vulnerable members of society, and the jury's expressions grew harder with each testimony. The defense strategy was predictable: blame it on confusion, on memory issues, on overly trusting elderly people who'd made their own financial decisions and now regretted them. But the documentary evidence was too strong, the pattern across multiple victims too clear. The prosecution demonstrated that Beverly Yang had been present during or shortly after the opening of every fraudulent account, that she'd had the opportunity to intercept mail in each case, that her bank deposits correlated exactly with the timing of withdrawals from victim accounts. Daniel Yang's cooperation provided the mechanism. He showed exactly how he'd used his access at All Care to harvest personal information, how he'd created the fraudulent applications, how he and Beverly coordinated their activities. And Marcus Bellamy's own emails undermined his defense. Messages where he'd been explicitly warned about suspicious employee activities and had responded by telling subordinates to handle it internally rather than reporting to authorities. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts for Beverly and Daniel Yang. Guilty on conspiracy and facilitating fraud for Marcus Bellamy, though he was acquitted on some of the more serious elder abuse charges due to his distance from the actual victims. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the intervening time, Rachel and I helped my mother begin the process of recovery, disputing the fraudulent charges, closing the unauthorized accounts, working with credit agencies to repair the damage to her credit score. The financial recovery would take time, but the psychological recovery was what concerned me most. My mother had been shaken by this experience in ways that extended beyond the money. She'd developed a wariness around new people, a hesitance to accept help, a tendency to double-check everything herself, even when it meant struggling with tasks that were physically difficult since the stroke. Torres connected us with a therapist who specialized in elder abuse trauma, someone who could help my mother process not just what had been done to her, but also the self-blame and shame that many victims experienced. The sentencing was everything I'd hoped for. Judge William Crawford, who'd presided over the trial, made clear his disgust for the crimes. He said, Beverly Yang received 15 years in federal prison. Daniel Yang, because of his cooperation, received 8 years. Marcus Bellamy received 5 years and a $2 million fine, with the added condition that he was permanently banned from working in any capacity related to healthcare, elder care, or administrative services for vulnerable populations. The sentences were longer than many white-collar criminals received, and Judge Crawford explained why. Quote, 35, quote, but the criminal case wasn't the end. Rachel and I, along with the other victims' families, filed a civil lawsuit against All Care Administrative Services, seeking compensation for damages and forcing the company into receivership. The civil case revealed even more about how All Care's business model had enabled abuse, inadequate background checks, no oversight of employee access to sensitive information, no procedures for reporting suspicious activities, active discouragement of whistleblowing. The company had prioritized profit and expansion over the safety of the vulnerable people whose information they controlled. The lawsuit resulted in a $15 million settlement, distributed among the victims according to their individual losses. My mother received $45,000, which covered her fraudulent charges and provided some compensation for the psychological harm. More importantly, the settlement terms required All Care to implement comprehensive reforms, mandatory background checks, oversight protocols, anonymous reporting systems, regular audits, and cooperation with adult protective services. The civil case also led to regulatory changes. Kapoor used the publicity around the case to push for stronger state laws protecting elderly people from financial exploitation. The legislation, passed 18 months after the trial, required care facilities to implement strict protocols for handling resident mail and finances, mandated training for staff on recognizing and reporting elder abuse, created a state registry of caregivers who'd been found guilty of exploitation, and strengthened criminal penalties for those who victimized elderly or disabled people. The law was named the Eleanor Whitmore Elder Protection Act, after my mother, who'd become something of an advocate for elder abuse awareness, speaking at facilities and senior centers about her experience and how others could protect themselves. 2 years after we first received those strange thank you cards, I sat in my mother's new apartment. She'd moved to a different facility, one with better oversight and security protocols, helping her sort through mail. She'd learned to be vigilant, checking every statement, questioning every charge, maintaining detailed records. The stroke had affected her dexterity, not her mind, and she'd reclaimed her confidence in that distinction. You know what's strange? She said, holding up a legitimate thank you card from a friend whose birthday she'd remembered. Quote, 37. She'd turned the trauma into a kind of power, taking control of the narrative around her own generosity and memory. I was proud of her resilience, even as I remained angry at what she'd had to endure to develop it. The thank you cards we'd received, Rachel and I, had all been saved, filed with other documentation from the case. Sometimes I'd take them out and read them, reminded of how something so innocuous, gratitude for generosity, had been weaponized as part of a systematic exploitation. The contrast between the pleasant content and the ugly reality they represented was stark. Quote, 38. One card read, quote, 39. But there had been no kindness, no generosity, only theft disguised as virtue, manipulation wrapped in courtesy. The cards had been tools of gaslighting, designed to make us question reality, to create confusion that would delay discovery of the fraud. They'd worked for a while. If we'd been less attentive, less persistent, Less willing to trust our own perceptions over seemingly official records, the fraud might have continued indefinitely. I thought often about the other victims who hadn't been as fortunate, who'd lost everything before anyone noticed. Harold Preston had recovered financially through the settlement, but never recovered psychologically from having been manipulated into signing over his power of attorney. He'd died 6 months after the trial, his daughter convinced that the stress and betrayal had broken something fundamental in him. Ruth Shapiro had moved in with her daughter, giving up her independence, never quite believing she deserved to be cared for after foolishly giving away her savings. The psychological scars persisted long after the financial damage was addressed, a reminder that some violations cut deeper than money could measure. Beverly Yang's crime wasn't just theft. It was the destruction of trust, the weaponization of care, the exploitation of vulnerability. Those wounds healed slowly, if they healed at all. Torres, the investigator who'd broken the case open, moved on to other investigations but stayed in touch. She told me once that the AllCare case had become a model for how to investigate and prosecute elder financial abuse, used in training programs across the country. The combination of criminal prosecution, civil action, regulatory reform, and victim advocacy had created a comprehensive response that addressed not just the immediate crimes, but the systemic failures that enabled them. Quote, 41. Torres said. Quote, 42. I appreciated her words, but I knew we'd been lucky too. Lucky that the thank you cards had reached us. Lucky that we'd had resources to hire an investigator. Lucky that we'd found prosecutors and judges who took these crimes seriously. Many victims weren't that fortunate. Rachel went back to teaching with a new awareness of how institutions could fail vulnerable people. She developed curriculum for her students about elder abuse, about financial literacy, about recognizing exploitation, she said. My mother's experience had affected her deeply, made her recognize how easily trust could be manipulated and how important vigilance was in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. We'd both changed from this experience, become more skeptical of surface appearances, more willing to question authority, more committed to advocating for those who lacked power or voice. The thank you cards had been an awakening, an accidental revelation of a hidden world of exploitation that existed just beneath the veneer of care and courtesy. 3 years after the cards first arrived, my mother died peacefully in her sleep at age 81. The stroke complications had progressed despite good care, and we'd known for months that her time was limited. In her final weeks, she'd been clear-minded and determined to tell me what mattered. I'm not angry anymore, she said one afternoon, holding my hand with her still strong left hand while her right lay useless in her lap. Beverly Yang stole from me, yes. She manipulated me, made me doubt myself, violated my trust. But you know what? She failed at the most important thing. She wanted to isolate me, make me vulnerable, break my spirit. Instead, she brought you closer, made me stronger, gave me purpose in my final years. I've spoken to hundreds of seniors about protecting themselves, helped change laws, possibly prevented others from being victimized. That's not the ending she intended, and that's the justice that matters most. She was right, though it took me longer to fully accept it. The violation had been real and terrible, but the response had created meaning. After the funeral, I found a box in my mother's apartment labeled, quote, 46, quote. Inside were carefully organized files, copies of all her financial statements, records of gifts she'd actually sent with corresponding thank you cards, notes about conversations and events proving her memory was intact. She'd created a comprehensive counter-narrative to the gaslighting she'd experienced, documented proof that she was still herself, still competent, still real. But underneath those files was something else, a handwritten letter addressed to me. Thomas, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and that's okay. I've lived a good life, and the last few years, despite everything, have been meaningful. The thank you cards that started all this, I want you to keep them. Not as reminders of what was taken, but as proof of what was revealed. Sometimes, the worst violations force the most important confrontations. Sometimes being targeted shows you exactly what's wrong with the world and gives you the chance to fight it. Keep fighting. Love, Mom. I kept the cards, both the fraudulent ones that had sparked the investigation and the real ones my mother had received after speaking publicly about elder abuse. Genuine expressions of gratitude from people she'd helped, from families she'd educated, from legislators who'd been moved to act by her testimony. Those cards represented the transformation of violation into purpose, of victimhood into advocacy, of personal trauma into collective protection. They sat on my desk now, a reminder that sometimes the most insidious crimes announce themselves in the most polite ways, that courtesy could conceal cruelty, that thank you could mean theft. But they also reminded me that vigilance mattered, that questioning appearances was necessary, that protecting the vulnerable was everyone's responsibility. The cards we'd received for gifts we never sent had revealed a world of systematic abuse operating in plain sight, disguised as care and generosity. Exposing that world, holding perpetrators accountable, creating systems to prevent future victimization, that was the real gift, the one worth being thanked for, the one that transformed random cruelty into meaningful justice. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.